Good to see you again.
All right. Ready to go?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go. Let me start where the debate kind of started on Monday night. And we're not going to get into politics. I know you're precluded from that, but this is substance.
Sure.
So Donald Trump talked a lot about the loss of jobs, and let's put aside his idea of how you solve the problem. But the fact is, we have lost huge numbers of manufacturing jobs. We lost something like 6 million manufacturing jobs in the first 9 years of the last decade. We gained a few back, a few 100,000, I think maybe 800,000, but they're starting to lose them again. So what part of his diagnosis of the problem is wrong, i.e. that this has to do with competition, fair or unfair, from places like Mexico and China?
Where do you start on that question?
Where you left off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm trying to answer the question in my official capacity. So
I said it's not political. It's about jobs.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, you look at. I'm going to extrapolate beyond manufacturing. I mean, you look at where we were when the president took over. This economy was hemorrhaging. 2.3 million jobs lost in the 3 months before he took office. The unemployment rate inching up toward 10%. There were 7 job seekers for every job opening. Now you look, and we've had 71 months in a row of job growth, 14 million jobs. There's 1.4 job seekers for every job opening instead of 7 job seekers for every job opening. And actually, in the last 2 years, where you see the biggest job growth, the 2 sectors, are both good middle-class sectors, business and professional services, education and health. By and large, the average wage is doing well. Manufacturing, I grew up in Buffalo, New York. The Bethlehem Steel of my youth and the Republic Steel of my youth employed tens of thousands of people. The Republic Steel plant is now replaced by what will be, when it opens up in a year or so, the largest solar panel manufacturing facility in the Western Hemisphere, Solar City. So they're using the same footprint, but they will have far fewer workers because of technology. And so you're going to see a lot more people walking around with iPads than, and you go to any manufacturing facility of today, and that's what you see. So I think it's important when we have these conversations not to conflate a lot of different forces. There's globalization, there's automation, and technology. And globalization has made the world smaller. And I think one of the things that's happened is that it has created some winners and losers, Steve. And I think sometimes policymakers are reluctant to acknowledge that there have been winners and losers. They think that everybody can benefit and nobody loses. And I think a big part of the angst we see today is that if you were in the textile industry down in the Carolinas, that was an industry because of globalization where capital and labor could easily move somewhere else. And so I think it's really it's difficult in a political cycle to have a rational conversation where you're kind of doing that regression analysis to say this is really what's happening or that's really what's happening.
Well, I'm trying to have a rational conversation, which is why you're here.
Yeah.
But in textiles, we've lost, I think, 80% of our textile jobs from when they peaked. But yes, there are going to be winners and losers. But in this case, you're talking about a whole segment of our economy, i.e. manufacturing, that many people believe we need to be in. No one would dispute your numbers on total jobs. Those are all obviously accurate. But nonetheless, at the moment, we are actually losing manufacturing jobs for this year so far, not gaining them. And so can we have an economy that simply doesn't have at its core some number of manufacturing jobs?
I think we can continue to make things. And again, the last year begs the 6 years that preceded it, where we were recovering. Not at the pace of the 90s, but where we were recovering.
Actually,
not at the pace of the 80s.
Right. But actually, as you know, the share of even during those 6 years, the share of manufacturing jobs was dropping, i.e. the number of manufacturing jobs was increasing more slowly than these total number of jobs that you were referring to.
Well, I mean, when you make products for export in the year 2016, where you have global demand is not where it is because the rest of the world isn't doing as well as the United States is, and when you have a strong dollar, that's a perfect storm for manufacturers. And so that is the challenge that we confront now. What I've seen in the export industry is, export-related jobs on average pay about 18% more. And so you go to the Boeing plant in Renton, Washington, where I've been, and those are good middle-class jobs. And so that's why trade-dependent states like Washington State, when you look at their aggregate wages and their aggregate standard of living, they're actually doing pretty darn well.
Those are good middle-class jobs, but as you know, Boeing has been playing the state of Washington off against the state of South Carolina to try to get the workers there to take lower wages or smaller increases anyway. Mexico is now in the jet production business. China's in the jet production business. So even those jobs are under some degree of threat or pressure.
Well, yes, and that's why the president's been talking about, obviously trade is an elephant in the room, and it's a very hard topic to discuss during an election season. And what the president's trying to do is put American values on globalization. So if you have a country where the government is subsidizing the aviation industry, you have an unlevel playing field. And so the reality that the president is trying to respond to is that 95% of the demand for products is outside the United States, and in addition, we need to reflect the reality that the status quo is an unlevel playing field for many workers and for many businesses. So how do we level the playing field in such a way that both the airline industry can compete and workers can compete? And that's what the president's trying to do.
So in that context, when I was doing some background reading on you, I saw you quoted as implying that you thought that NAFTA was either badly negotiated or just a mistake.
No, I mean, NAFTA was a lot of promises that were made that in reality were not kept. And let me be specific. NAFTA required a country to comply with their own laws. And if your own laws in the labor context are Swiss cheese, that's not a very high bar. And so the question presented on the trade front is, do we accept the status quo, which in the case of NAFTA is a low bar or a no bar, or do we try to improve that? And so that's what the president has been trying to do in TPP. As we speak right now, the Mexican Senate is debating a series of constitutional and statutory reforms to their labor justice system, because as a practical matter, it is very hard for someone to organize an independent labor union. And when you go to their equivalent of the NLRB, it is broken. And so if you can build institutions that help raise the middle class in Mexico, that actually has ancillary and very real positive benefit for folks back here. So can you learn from NAFTA is, I think, the question, because NAFTA was promises made and in many cases not promises kept.
So badly negotiated, or
it was the state of the art at the time.
All right,
I think it's unfair to, with hindsight, say you should have done this and should have done that, because we know 20 years later what worked and what didn't work.
Okay. Let me move on to the question of jobs, and you talked about how many jobs have been created. Again, there's no disagreement about that. But as you know, we have a smaller percentage of prime-age men, 25 to 54, in the labor force here than in France. We have a smaller percentage of prime-age women in the labor force here, or about the same as in Japan. The labor force participation rate, people who are looking for work, is at, I think, 1977 level. Some of that's demographics and other factors. But how do you, A, do you agree that those are all the facts, and B, how do you address that problem?
The labor force participation rate right now has inched up from where it was a year ago. I think it's about 62.8% now. It's about 62.4 a year ago. But having said that, there's an undeniable movement downward. About 50% of that, according to economists, is demographics, people aging. There's about a quarter of it that people, frankly, disagree on. They don't know what it is. And then there's at least a quarter of it where public policy can make a difference. And I think there are three things that we could do, Steve, that could really make a difference. Number one, I'll do number one and number two together, and that is to have sensible paid leave and child care laws at a federal level. One more piece of data. Thank you. Let me give you one more data point. The female labor force participation rate, women between 25 and 54, in the US and Canada in 2000 was virtually identical. Now Canada is about 8 points higher. Everyone agrees that it's higher because they've invested in sensible paid leave laws at a federal level. So if we had simply kept pace with Canada, we'd have 5.5 million more women in the workforce. I don't know what that translates to on labor force participation, but it's significant. And similarly, I meet so many people in my travels whose child care bills exceed their rent or their mortgage. And so we're living in a modern family world, and we have these Leave It a Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet sets of public policy. So those are two things that we could do. And then the third, very briefly, gets back really to your first question, which is infrastructure investment at scale. Because infrastructure investment creates jobs across many sectors and then has a multiplier effect. And I think that would dramatically increase labor force participation. The president tried his hardest to get infrastructure.
How would infrastructure increase? I understand how it's good for the economy and productivity and all that. How does it increase labor force participation, the number of people who actually say they want to have a job?
Well, I think right now, I think we have so much demand for infrastructure, not just our roads and our bridges, but our pipes. Flint is not an isolated incident. And so the more people that you employ in there, I think you have a multiplier effect. And certainly a number of economists have.
Well, that creates jobs, but does it bring people back in the labor force? For example, to your point about family leave, I think I'm right in saying that the percentage of unmarried men out of the labor force is actually higher than the percentage of married men out of the labor force. In other words, if you're married, you're more likely to stay in the labor force. You have a family to support. If you're unmarried, you're more likely to drop out of the labor force. So it's not necessarily a family leave issue or things like that.
Well, I haven't looked at the distinctions between married and unmarried men and women. What I do know is that there are a lot more dual career couples where actually the man is now staying home. Still much more likely for the woman to stay home. And I meet family after family whose very personal decisions about how many children they have are a function of our broken public policy. And frankly, Wall Street and the Silicon Valley and so many places around America would be far more gender diverse if we invested in sensible paid leave laws at a federal level. And we're the only nation on the planet, the only industrialized nation on the planet that doesn't have some form of paid leave. And frankly, we're the only nation on the planet where paid leave is an ideological issue that has divided our parties.
I think there's a lot of support here for paid leave. I heard that. So let me move on to the other side of the employment question, which are wages. Mm-hmm. So as I'm sure you're going to say, wages have begun to go up after quite a number of years of dropping, but they are still below, median family incomes are still well below their peak in 2000, well below where they were before the recession. Certainly income inequality is greater, so for people at the bottom, wages are even more depressed. I'm not going to go back through the whole manufacturing thing, but it's even worse in manufacturing in many ways than it is in services. So how do we address this wage problem and get middle-class people having incomes going up again?
Well, one way to do it is to make sure we continue to have tighter labor markets. You look at the issue of productivity and wage growth. From the end of World War II until about 1980, productivity and wage growth went hand in hand. So workers baked the pie of prosperity. They shared in the spoils. In 1980, until really, with the exception of a period in the late 90s, you saw the decoupling of productivity and wages. And I think there are a number of forces. A number of economists have looked at the issue of the decline of union density and say that almost a third of the challenges that folks in the middle class are confronting are the result of declining labor union density, because when you have strength in numbers, you have leverage. We have to continue our investments in our human capital.
So how would you increase union membership?
Well, I think you have all these, there's an unmitigated assault on labor unions across a number of states, and there was a case that went before the Supreme Court recently, and frankly, if Justice Scalia had not passed away, it would have really made it very difficult for public sector labor unions to organize, and that would have been one step in a very transparent and well choreographed set of objectives from folks on the far right to eviscerate the labor movement. I think that's a bad thing. I think collective bargaining has been one of the biggest forces that helped bring us the middle class in America. So I think there is a very important role in, for instance, who you choose to be on the Supreme Court in terms of the right to organize.
But we don't want to get into politics, although you have a lot of supporters here, so if
yes.
you want to run for
Well,
office, I think they're all...
No, but
they're
I
all,
mean, that's one, but that's certainly not the only thing. For me, my parents always taught me that education was the great equalizer. And you look at the unemployment rates by educational attainment, and there's an undeniable education dividend. And we
sure,
have
but
not...
that takes a long time to fix, right? You have to wait for a whole cohort of people to go through the educational system. You're not going to send a 50-year-old person to college.
Well, actually, my mother started college the same year I started college. So I think education is lifelong. And so... and here's what else I would say, Steve, and this is one of the things that is one of those few bipartisan things that's happening right now, which is there's a universal recognition of the incredible power of apprenticeship. When people think of apprenticeship, they think of your plumber or your electrician, and certainly in the skilled trades, apprenticeship has a long and storied history. But what we're doing as we build the skills superhighway for the 21st century is we're dramatically expanding apprenticeship, expanding the reach of apprenticeship. So we're using it in the IT sector. The 5.8 million job openings that are out there right now, roughly a tenth are in the IT sector. And there are a substantial portion of those that don't require a college degree. And so I can take you to programs where someone's going to a 20-week coding camp and they're doubling their salary at the end of the day. Apprenticeship is the other college, except without the debt. And so that's another example of, I think, a series of targeted investments that we're making, that we're seeing a real return on investment. Employers have much more skin in the game right now in the workforce context. They're understanding that you can't have cannibalism as your HR model. I'm going to steal your talent, and then you steal mine, and it's zero sum. There is a really exciting, it's not an A1 of the New York Times exciting, but it's a game-changing, exciting metamorphosis occurring where sectors are coming together and saying, you know what, we need more IT specialists. Let's work together on that. We need more allied health professionals. And these are jobs that are $30 an hour jobs. So rather than Hopkins going to the University of Maryland and stealing theirs, let's work together and build tomorrow's talent. And it doesn't require a 20-year investment. You can retool folks overnight.
Well, on that optimistic note, we're going to have to end. I hope you're right, and we wish you well, and thank you so much for being
Great.
here today.
Pleasure to be here.